Again, I'm Marion Fox. This is our 53rd lesson, and we are getting almost through with chapter 13. We have several more chapters to go, but we probably have 60, 65 lessons altogether, somewhere thereabouts. So this lesson tonight will be a little shorter. We're going to look at rejection of evidence by atheists. So we're going to look at some of the state of mind or the way of thinking of atheists, and things that will help us to understand what's going on in our scientific community. Now, keep in mind, I believe that science is good if it's really true science. But sometimes just using the word science and calling something science doesn't make it science. Let me illustrate this. It's been told, and of course, a lot of stories have been told about what Abraham Lincoln said. He supposedly asked an audience one time, if I call a cow's tail a leg, how many legs does she have? And a bunch of people answered 5 legs. And he said, no, it doesn't. Because if I call it a leg, doesn't make it a leg. And so calling something science, if it's not following the scientific method, which requires that you observe it. And so it has to be observed. And if it's not observed, then it's not true science. It's not following the scientific method. Now, keep that in mind. So, atheists are reluctant to accept the evidence. We're going to look at their reluctance. A number of examples can be cited to demonstrate that atheists have either falsified the evidence or rejected overwhelming evidence that disproved their theories. We'll be showing that in this lesson, and we'll show some more in the following lesson. I think some theists, some who claim to believe in God and in the God of the Bible, have been guilty of this same dishonesty. We should never falsify any evidence or even twist it or take it out of context in order to prove something. If the Bible teaches something, it is taught clearly enough that we can see it and learn it from the text itself. We never need to mishandle God's word. I think that's disingenuous, and that's something a real true Christian would never do. I think that's very important, that we keep that in the back of our mind. When atheists cite as fact what they cannot prove, they're irrational, they're not rational. And they could be dishonest, but it's not rational to claim something when you don't have evidence to support it. Libby, and this is the man that got the Nobel Prize for coming up with the carbon-14 or radiocarbon dating system, he said, we had a decay curve drawn which predicted, with no unknown factors, no unadjustable constants, the specific activity of ancient mummies. And so the question was to see whether it worked. And so the research consisted of 2 stages. The first shock Dr. Arnold and I had, and Dr. Arnold worked with him on this system, and I had was that our advisors informed us that history extended back only 5,000 years. Now, from the time he did this, around 1950. So that would be back around 3000 BC. We had thought initially that we would be able to get samples all along the curve back to 30,000 years, put the points in, and then our work would be finished. And why do you only go back 30,000? Because you get back around 30 to 40,000 years, and that's about as far as you could reasonably use radiocarbon dating, assuming you had all of the information right. So that's why he's saying that. And that's he's not telling you that's why it is, but that's the case. So we read books. You read books and find statements that such and such a society or archaeological site is 20,000 years old. We learn rather abruptly that these numbers, these ancient ages, are not known. In fact, it is about the time of the first dynasty of Egypt that the last historical date of any real certainty has been established. Now, I showed earlier that that's not even true. That other sources will tell us you can go back about 600 BC to link some of the early dates. Now, these ancient ages are not known. In fact, see, they're not known. I emphasize that. He's admitting this. And the last historical date of any real certainty that's been established is the first dynasty of Egypt. So we had in the initial stages the opportunity to check against knowns, principally Egyptian artifacts. And the second stage, we had to go into the great wilderness of prehistory to see whether there was elements of internal consistency. So they wanted to believe that the message was sound. Consistency with what? Consistency with other dating systems that we have. That's what he runs into. That's what he means with internal consistency. So now he says we really couldn't calibrate it. Couldn't go back and calibrate it with other information. He was hoping to calibrate his system, but he could only go back to about 3000 BC, according to him. But I don't think he could go back to 3000 BC. We showed that earlier, that that's not the case. Previous quote of Livy demonstrates that some anthropologists and some historians have been making assertions without any real evidence. And they knew they had no hard evidence. They just asserted it. They start out with the assumption that man evolved. And so they put that into their framework. Now, keep that in mind. They're making a claim and don't have any evidence to support it. And they'll say, look, we are experts in this field, so we must be right. And of course, that's a fallacious line of reasoning to begin with. Fraud is all too common in research. It's very common. I've observed that doctoral candidates seldom obtain their degree if their research has negative results. It's been my observation over the years. You better have positive results or they'll really get after you pretty heavy. You have to redo your thesis. There's pressure to have successful results for all research. It doesn't work very well. You don't get much money and you don't get much support if you don't have a positive result with your research. There are exceptions, and that's true. And we have to understand, and hopefully we'll be able to do that before this course is over, understand truly how true science works. But Hamilton, and again, this is all in the book, said fraud is a growth industry. Ethics watchers who argue that the situation is a fact of life in academia, and he goes on and says, the issue of misconduct isn't about to go away. The fraud circuit is booming. And this article by Hamilton tells us. In other words, he's really bemoaning the fact that this is a problem in scientific. There was a Piltdown man that was used to support evolution, organic macroevolution, was discovered to be a fraud. It was a fraud. It was not just an accident. They actually concocted it as a fraud. With the Piltdown skull, Britain could point to a great contribution to the study of human evolution. The specimen known as Piltdown Man occupied an honored place in the catalogs of fossil hominoids for the next 40 years. That's something to read about. It's an embarrassment to the scientific community. But in 1953, and this is a quote now, thanks to, and this whole section here is a quote. The quote starts right here with quotation marks with the Piltdown skull. But in 1953, thanks to some rigorous scholarly detective work, Piltdown Man was revealed to be a forgery manufactured from modern human and animal remains that they painted and they made it to make it look older. Moreover, the existence of a hoax, he says, and it was a hoax, so subtle and so close to being successful, sows the seed of doubt that everywhere elsewhere in science, some of the foundations of knowledge are anchored in sand. And what happened here is that hoax was set up and designed to prove evolution was true. Now that tells me something, that they didn't think they had good evidence to support their organic microevolution. You don't resort to a hoax if you have good solid evidence. No rational person would do that. If I have good evidence, why manufacture false evidence? Use the sound evidence that no one will catch me in. This doubt fuels the strong impression much abroad today that fraud in science has become more frequent. Tobias tells us. It's pretty important that we understand this. Piltdown Man, there was another one called Nebraska Man, and it wasn't a hoax. They found a tooth and they assumed it was a human tooth. When they examined the tooth more thoroughly much later, but this was called Nebraska Man. Supposedly, this was the tooth of a man. So they took a tooth and they manufactured a whole man from it, and they made this whole skeleton up from just one tooth. And they found out it was a pig's tooth later, when they examined it more fully. And they had manufactured this whole this humanoid. If you look, a lot of times they have manufactured and drawn with drawings and come up with just a jawbone or something like that, and they put a skull on it. They put other bones on it to make it look like something, look like human. And they only had a piece of a skull or just a jawbone or something like that. And everything else was manufactured in the mind of the person that drew it. Piltdown Man was used by atheists to prove that macroevolution has occurred. Roger Poisson, here's another one. We could get off on the Piltdown Man. But Roger Poisson falsified much of the data in the breast cancer research project, got caught in it. Other examples that we cited of this dishonesty, you can do an internet search and find them. And the reader you should always remember that this is a possibility when reading from research that has not been replicated by other independent researchers. I remember there was a group that was claiming they had come up with cold fusion, nuclear fusion, which is fission is the atomic bomb and fusion is the hydrogen bomb. And so they're different processes. And so they claimed to come up with fusion, cold fusion. Well, normally we have to get it real hot with something like lasers to fuse atoms. And so they claimed they had cold fusion. Boy, this was going to generate lots of energy. And it kind of fizzled out. And we don't know whether it's a hoax or they just interpreted their data wrong, but this hasn't happened. Even if the research has been replicated now, they tried to replicate the cold fusion and they couldn't do it. Even if the research has been replicated, readers should always ask what assumptions have been made in the research. You know, you can do research on information and get with making the right assumptions, you can skew the research the way you want to if you're dishonest. And so we need to look at it very, very carefully. See what model and what statistical model they used or system they used to evaluate the evidence. On my doctoral dissertation, I pointed out that another dissertation had used the wrong statistical mechanism to evaluate their evidence. And I showed that they had flawed, and I showed why my system was correct. And so I had to argue for my statistical method, as well as defend my research when I did mine. And so that's very important that we understand that. Now, the embryonic recapitulation, and embryonic, that's an embryo, and recapitulation. Supposedly what happens with the embryonic recapitulation theory, it was based on altered drawings of embryos by Ernst Heinrich Haeckel. He was born in 1834 and died in 1919. Now, here's the situation. They say, well, we can look at the embryo and it looks like this and this and this, and they supposedly go through the stages from reptiles to mammals and so forth. It goes through all the stages. So the embryo goes through all, it recapitulates all the stages of organic evolution. But Haeckel falsified his embryo drawings. He altered them. He took embryo drawings and altered them to make it look like happened. And the one thing that gives good reason to question honesty of some macroevolutionists is that they still use Haeckel's altered drawings in some biology books to prove that macroevolution occurs. And they're using falsified drawings that were known to be falsified and have not been known to be falsified over 100 years. But they're still using them because they fit what they're trying to do with their macroevolution. That tells me they're not honest. And I don't trust them for that reason. That's a good reason not to trust them. In addition, they still use other arguments for macroevolution in public school textbooks that have been rejected by the scientific community. So the textbooks in the public schools and the younger people, they're fed this stuff and they don't know enough to know that it's an unsound argument. And the writers of the textbooks are not honest. That tells you there's something wrong with their system, because if it was a sound system, they would use sound arguments. They wouldn't rely on unsound arguments. We've already seen how many of the arguments for an old Earth are based upon substantive uniformitarianism. In spite of the fact, most geologists have rejected substantive uniformitarianism. Yet their arguments for the age of the Earth are nearly all of them linked to that. The rate of sea force splitting and so forth, all of these things are based upon substantive uniformitarianism. The reluctance to accept evidence disproving their assertion is even more disconcerting. Now, they use arguments that have been rejected by the bulk of the scientific community. Sometimes arguments that they themselves have explicitly rejected, such as substantive uniformitarianism. And yet, they're inconsistent. You can't have both. You can't reject substantive uniformitarianism and turn around and use it if you rejected it. And so they're reluctant to accept evidence. Why? Well, because they don't have an argument to support their claim. So it's the only argument they've got. That tells me that their whole system is shaky. Here's another one, and this, of course, gets into anthropology. In the meantime, one might conclude that it was rotten luck that all of the 12 directly dated maize cobs, now maize is the word that's used for Indian corn, what we call Indian corn, which are field corn kind. And the dated beanpole are younger than 5,000 to 3,000 years old, 3,500 years old. But undated specimens of the Tehuacan assemblages may still be more than 3,500 years old. Seems to be the position taken by writers who either ignore the AMS dates altogether, or refer to them in ways that do not alter scenarios. Fritz is saying, we have found that our dating was wrong, all right? Yet they are ignoring the fact that our dating was wrong and using the older dating system. In other words, they have not accepted the evidence. Fritz is upset by it. The strong reluctance to be truly scientific and follow the evidence demonstrates their bias and creates doubt about their credibility. It shows that they might even be dishonest. Let me illustrate another one. Simon LeVay published an article in Science magazine, and you publish in the Science magazine, you've pretty well arrived in the scientific community in 1991, in which that's in Science is the magazine in the United States, and then Nature is the equivalent to it in England, in which he claimed to have evidence to support the contention that homosexuality is hereditary. Now, homosexuals have tried for quite some time to prove that it's hereditary. We're just this way because it's hereditary. This contention and the research that was used to support the contention have been contradicted by several scientists. Now, we'll look at this and just very briefly in the next few minutes. J. Michael Bailey and Richard C. Pillard also conducted research in which they concluded that homosexuality is genetic as well. Bauer cites them. 2 years later, a group led by Dean H. Hamar, the National Cancer Institute, linked male homosexuality to a gene on the X chromosome, according to Horgan. Now, again, these are published articles. Okay. Billings and Beckworth discussed several flaws in the research methodology of these studies that were published on homosexuality being hereditary. And they've just about shown that they weren't sound. So the research methodology was flawed, and then when they tried to replicate it, there was contradictory evidence of those who claimed to prove that homosexuality is hereditary. So that there's evidence contradicting it. And so what we find out is it's just not true. Hereditary. At least there's no evidence to substantiate that it is. Horgan states LeVay's findings has yet to be fully replicated. In other words, they haven't replicated this by another researcher. As for Hamer, one study has contradicted his results. More disturbingly, he, that would be Hamer, has been charged with research improprieties and is now under investigation by the Federal Office of Research Integrity. There is an Office of Research Integrity to investigate fraudulent research. Okay, it's so widespread that they have an organization to research to attack it, or to prosecute it. Now, that's very interesting. Again, this claim, and we're looking at homosexuality being hereditary, is just not substantiated by the evidence. No evidence to support it. The evidence has been contradicted, and there was fraud in the research. Used the wrong methodology, and there was fraud. Charles Lyell, basically introduced uniformitarian geology. He made it popular, I should say. Used deceitful methods to push his theory of uniformitarianism. We pointed this out already in our studies, so I'll bring this back up because it fits in right here. Alvarez et al. Say it is a widespread view among geologists that uniformitarianism, as developed by Charles Lyell in the first half of the 19th century, provided an essential antidote to biblically inspired ad hoc catastrophism in the 18th and 19th centuries. In other words, it gave us an answer to the Bible, is what he's saying. And it's an ad hoc answer to it. We don't even have to argue. We've got an answer to it. We don't have to answer the arguments based upon the Bible. So that's what he's saying. However, Gould, that's Stephen Jay Gould, a famous atheist, I think he's dead now, has also shown, he's not an atheist anymore, I would say, has also shown that this interpretation does injustice to the scientific catastrophism. So it does injustice to it. He also points out that Lyell used a rhetorical trick of giving the same name to very different concepts in substantive methodological uniformitarianism. Now, we talked about this earlier, but you see it's a rhetorical trick. Rhetoric is to try to convince someone. It's a trick to try to convince people. And so he says, in order to push a rigidly gradualistic view of geological processes, which can now be seen to be far from correct. So it's just not true. And so he was trying to push two different concepts, substantive and methodological uniformitarianism. The principle of uniformity, I believe, is true. That's the methodological uniformitarianism. That is, we can apply the same laws of science throughout all of the universe. As far as we know, the laws of science will apply on the Earth. The same laws of gravity, for example, would apply on the Moon and the Earth and Mars and other places. On our probes we've sent there, we found this to be the case. Lyell, according to Alvarez, used a rhetorical trick of giving the same name to very different concepts. Now, I have this quote now. I want you to see it. This is the fallacy of equivocation. Equivocation in logic is when you change your name or change the definition of something. It's a deceptive, it's fraudulent rhetorical technique. Hurley, in the logic book, and that's one of the best logic books I've found, and the fallacy of equivocation occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that one or more words are used either explicitly or implicitly in two different senses in the argument. That's exactly what we see here. You change horses in the middle of the stream. You change the definition of the word while you're talking about it. You just shift definitions and change definitions. And some people do that. Politicians are real bad about doing it. Atheism has no objective standard of ethics. I keep this in mind. There's no way an atheist can determine right and wrong, because without God, there is no standard. And we'll get an atheist here that actually admits it. In the universe of electrons and selfish genes, see, that all we are is we're atoms. We're atoms. We're just chemicals. And selfish genes. The genes are selfish. They try to duplicate themselves, and that's all they're doing. Blind physical forces, genetic replication. Some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you can't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. Well, that's a pretty negative statement. This is Dawkins, famous atheist. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. That's Richard Dawkins, page 85. I have the book where he said that, and I quoted it here accurately. But now, the copy of the article where he said it. What we have here is the rejection of evidence. They don't believe there is a good and evil. They don't believe there's a right and wrong in anything. There's no purpose, there's no design, there's no good, there's no evil. That's exactly what atheists believe. This is precisely what is implied by it. There's neither good nor evil. No act is evil, no act is good. If no act is evil, no act is good, it doesn't hurt for me to lie and deceive people. There's no way that you can say I'm doing wrong. Dawkins admits that atheists have been reluctant to admit. There is no objective standard of ethics for the atheist. There's no something outside him. He does what's right in his own eyes, and he defines what's wrong in his own eyes. And a true atheist cannot say that murder or stealing or lying is wrong. There's no way they can say it. He merely does what he wants to do with no standard. He has no standard of right and wrong. Stanley, and I had this as a textbook in graduate school, quotes Arnold Nash as saying, it was moreover claimed that science has obviously failed to solve the problems of the modern world, and confronted with the problem of the values, it has either remained silent or declared the values are essentially arbitrary or irrational. Now, Stanley quotes Arnold Nash, a famous man, famous atheist. In other words, science cannot answer the question of what's right and wrong. There's no way that the scientific method can draw a conclusion about what's right and wrong. It observes and makes observations. It does not determine the reasons or whys and wherefores or what's morally good or evil. Cannot do it. And so if a scientist doesn't believe there's a God, he has no way of determining good and evil because his science won't do it for him. And if, as John Dewey pushed our schools to teaching, the only way you know anything is the scientific method. You don't know anything by any way except the scientific method. And that being the case, if that's the case, then science cannot tell you what's good and evil. And that's precisely what we see in the earlier quote that we had. It's precisely why the atheist has no compunction to commit fraud. He has no objective standard of ethics, no objective standard. This is precisely what Paul, the apostle, said would happen when people refuse to have God in their knowledge. Read with me in Romans 1, 28 to 32. And even as they refused to have God in their knowledge, God gave them up unto a reprobate mind. Reprobate mind is they refused to have God in their knowledge. In the Greek, it says they analyzed God and discarded him as being unworthy. And so God gave them up to a reprobate mind. He examined them and found them unworthy to do those things which are not fitting. So he gave them up. And here's what they do, being filled with all unrighteousness. They don't treat people by the same standard. They're unrighteous. They have a double standard. That's unrighteous. Wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, hateful to God, insolent, bold, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, they don't keep their word, without natural affection, they don't even love their family members, unmerciful. You see that in abortion, unmerciful, who have known the ordinance of God, that they that practice those things are worthy of death, not only to do the same, but also consent with them that practice them. And this, we could look at this in more detail, but this is the rejection of evidence that God exists. They refuse to have God in their knowledge. I think the author, William James, has written one of the best articles on the subject of fraud and science that I've seen. I want to give you a short quote from this article where he says this: the willingness to commit fraud seems widespread. A recent paper reported that about a third of applicants for gastroenterology fellowships in the United States had misrepresented their academic accomplishments. A third of them, 1 out of 3. The misrepresentation included citation of non-existent articles in actual journals, articles in non-existent journals, and articles falsely identified as in press. James summarizes this, and he says, scientific fraud should be regarded as perhaps regrettable, but certainly an ineradicable, interesting and integral part of science. And it's perhaps regrettable, just perhaps, might be regrettable. I think it's a shame. To me, it's not. Quite disappointing that he states that fraud is perhaps regrettable. Science is not perhaps regrettable, it's a disgrace. Demonstrates the ethical bankruptcy of atheism. Do all scientists perpetrate fraud? Well, I don't believe so. I don't believe they all do. Certainly not, but it's common and there's pressure to conform to the norm. And we'll be showing this pressure in our next lesson. Conflicting ideas are often swept under the rug and ignored until there's a crisis in science. Even some of the quotes that we've had earlier tell us that. These quotes that we just had are not from the pens of theists, but of atheists, and are from reputable journals. I could have quoted a number of other sources citing fraud in other areas. The journals contain a number of articles relating to fraud in the scientific community. You summarize it, and the lesson is yours. Evidence has been rejected by some scientists, not all scientists. Keep that in mind. Fraud has been committed in support of certain aspects of atheism. I'm not saying that all of them commit fraud, but there's been enough of it that you cannot trust them without looking through their arguments very carefully, raking them through with a fine-tooth comb. Now, that ends our lesson for tonight.